think how Americans want to hold on to the Constitution, or the English want to hold on to their monarchy. So in some ways we're constantly trying to still a process which is also constantly moving. China has an incredible example of this, between the open movement of things. In the 12th century, historians, economic historians can now see that in the 12th century, China had virtually every condition to open capitalism. But the rulers of China suppressed it. They understood that if they let the capitalist genie out of the bottle, they would not be able to control it. In the 16th century, China had major ocean-going ships. There is one argument that Chinese ships got as far as the Bay of San Francisco. It's not, but certainly serious ocean-going vessels. A change in policy and interiorization, that China would not deal with the outside world, and they burnt all the ocean-going ships in China. 17th century. Two examples of, therefore, holding back artifactual transformation. We are placed, as I said, indicated before, in a much more peculiar place. We have a world that incessantly could be other. And in fact, our cultural difficulty is not with negotiating determinism in a way, it's negotiating with possibility. And this is much harder culturally than we wish to acknowledge. I mean, I think we're partly paralyzed by this, and it's why I fear an end to democracy in this century. Seriously do. I think actually authoritarian models will become very popular, as they did in the middle of the 20th century, because they will be seemingly cut through the so-called paralysis of democracy. Infinite choice is infinitely difficult, and made more complex by the fact that artifacts like nature proliferates, often uselessly, as in consumption, and also by the fact that we are bombarded by two contradictory messages. Nothing can be changed, especially economically, witness response to the financial crisis. Everything is mutable. All products, no social relationships, or work relationships, and above all, you yourself as a person. This is really the contradictory messages we have. The system cannot be changed. It's tiny, it's detailed. Right? Europe has an ongoing financial crisis, but you are infinitely we have enormous difficulty with this, and we've got to resolve it. And I think we have to resolve it in some ways through design. Now, one way to look at this in terms of this big socio-political issue, let me bring it back to design, give you a few empirical instances, and then try and pull some things out about some sort of, not exactly laws or instincts, but let's look at this and see if we can actually see at the end a strategic possibility. I'm sorry this is going on for a bit, but I'm not going to get further behind my lectures, otherwise you will never get. Let's look at some examples. Designing the things that could be instances from which to frame a model to kind of begin to understand. One thing of understanding about things could be other and what determines things is to look at the conditions behind things. And I picked a really arbitrary set of slides here to play with, but let me try and follow this. Here are two jet airliners. This is the famous de Havilland Comet airliner. 1949, the first commercial jet airliner made in Britain, and quite an engineering leap at the time. And here is the Boeing 747, the ancestor of the Boeing 747, which is virtually the kind of workhorse of the sort of airline, especially intercontinental flights worldwide. Two planes, roughly, I mean, not that dissimilar, but where the conditions, not engineering conditions, but social conditions, determine the plane. The de Havilland Comet was conceived during the war, built just after the war. But it was built by people, by a company and people who had a 1930s mindset What was that mindset? Well, most of the international flights before World War II, from Britain anyway, were connected to the empire. They were elite by the definition. You had a very small number of people flying. Flight was very expensive. You didn't need the principal routes seen as from London were over to Africa, Asia, and so on, where you would stop off for refueling because that's what planes did. And so when the BOAC comment was rolled out, the first version only had seats for 36 passengers. Very small. And it couldn't fly the Atlantic. Just about economic balance. It had small engineering problems too. But basically, these conditions, the Boeing 707, which is essentially developed late 50s, early 60s, was built in a notion within a country where the notion of mass travel was axiomatic, where the automatic way to think of range for a large-scale jet was sort of coast to coast, 3,500 miles, the same roughly as the Atlantic. You're already kind of thinking about the scale of an intercontinental jet. To make a jet large enough to hold to carry the fuel in order to make that flight, you make it large enough to be economic, which means that you make it, even if it's first version, of at least 100 cities. So different, subtly different social conditions that people may have been in some ways aware of and in other ways not aware of, determining even engineering decisions. And so thinking about how actually conditions determine. Second example, categories, which I wrote about and gave you a little bit of reading on. Categories. Human artifacts that we want to believe are not artifacts, especially when we come down to ethnicity, religion, race, white, black, female, male, Serb, Croat, so on and so forth. Categories. I'm breaking categories. 1983, two things come out. Daniel Wild's Little Bag Radio. It's about the first year I am teaching design and things, and I love this. I think it's just beautiful. Beautiful. It's now commonplace, but 1983 was a kind of break of expectation. Even better was walking into Ron Arad's studio shop in London one day, hearing a beautiful Bach cantata played, looking down and seeing that it was being played on this thing. This is 1983. This is at a time when people have a complete fetish of those strange things called LP records that probably none of you here have ever played. It's when you could really listen out and be rude. I know. But this is at a time when people are fetishistic about it. You went to someone's house and they care. There was this lump of concrete. I couldn't believe what I'm looking at. It is in a way a one-off joke, and in another it's very serious. There's the full ensemble. Wood, evidently concrete, is superb for amplifiers. Wood. It's a joke, but it gives you instantly a lesson. It reminds you how much designing is done to a category, like the VCR. And the shattering, the breaking of categories, the relativizing of human categories too, is I think one of the most important. And let's not forget that categories are subjective. Here's a design revolution by elimination. The miniskirt is one of the great social revolutions of our time. 1962, thereabouts. There's only 3 years difference in the photographs of those two. The women are the same age practically. But look at the social difference. Middle class English print. This lady is going to have my tea ready. No way. It is, there is a, do you see what I'm saying? You shatter a certain kind of category by doing a defect, in this case, You shrink a shirt, a skirt. It transforms not only an object, but how you can behave. A category. Other examples I've shown before. The postulative, whereby the design now has this quality where it's messing up with categories. I think I've said to you before, there are really three main categories of things. Those which we take to be real things because we have to. Like when you get on a plane, we have to believe it's real. Those things that we accept, which are made, books that we categorize fiction, say, as again non-fiction. The third category of things is those that are made, but we refuse to accept they're made, gods, kings. But there's a fourth category which the design does, which messes across with these, where it's both real and not real at the same time. And this is why I love the philosophy. It's postulative. It's real, you can inhabit it, it was inhabited as a house, and yet it's also a fiction. It's also a kind of a premise from the future landing in the present, but it's not just the future because it's in the present. You can think about the complexities and contradictions of this object, and it is beautiful and a challenge and a question because of that. So part of the capacity of design in relationship to things can be other, is positing things that become a question back to other things. Then we can look at the prefigurative thing. Perhaps notice this, use this example before, but it's the Finsbury Health Centre in London, developed in 1938, a forerunner of what became in Britain the National Health Service. A whole example of the idea of community medicine, care, modernity, light, cheerful atmosphere, and a kind of totally different approach to healthcare than had previously been. And instantly popular, it's still actually in use in London, and became in fact part of British political propaganda during World War II, or at least it would have done had not Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, vetoed this poster on the grounds it was too political. The point here is that design working for changing things by making an object which is prefigurative of that which you wish to have. The prototype for the ideally, if you like, a stereotype of things. You know, it's prototype, stereotype, but now understanding this in socio-political terms. And finally, this is what we come down to, in that really what we're talking about here is really possibility itself and designing for possibility. And we could say that this is what designing is today. The exploration of possibility in a historical condition where possibility is our condition. So our responsibility, and not just designers, it would apply to academics in general, is exploring possibility. The philosopher Agamben says, this is in any case what we are. Possibility is what it is. The simple fact of one's own existence as possibility or potentiality, that is our essence. Not some X or Y or Z, that is our essence. It's a great statement. It opens us immediately. It's one of the most political statements I know for this century. And we could think of our situation today in terms of a series of kind of four overlapping circles. Person's nature, artifice, technology, possibility. And these things are now kind of brought together in our world. And the circles overlap so much that exploring one is really exploring, almost exploring the others. And our design work and our ethics is this exploration. Design can be said to be kind of like a thread between these layers, exploring their relation. Milan Kundera, a few years ago, saw this in relationship to the novel, a great quotation, which we apply directly to design. The sole raison d'etre of a novel, Kundera says, is to explore the realm of human possibilities. Everything man can become, everything is capable of. Novelists draw up a map of existence by discovering, note, this or that human possibility, not by recording it, reporting it. Boring novelists just tell you what is. Good novelists, Kundera says, discover. A novelist that does not discover a hitherto unknown segment of existence is immoral. That's a great Occam's razor. We could do with a design equivalent to that. A design work that did seek to discover a hitherto unknown segment of our possible relationship to artifice would be immoral. We ought to kind of have that ethic. Occam's razor. And this notion, except that in design, it might not be quite discovering, it's not quite like uncovering hidden lures. It's more like showing, demonstrating, exemplifying. This is where the model, the prototype, the making comes back in. Because we're showing, demonstrating, exemplifying hitherto unregarded or not understood or not seen possibilities or potentiality within a situation. And once we grasp this idea that we're seeing possibilities within a situation, this opens up another way of thinking about design too. And this is perhaps better thought in Chinese thought than in Western thought. Now I'm just beginning to read to this, though I'm not. But I found this great quotation in a book by Francis Jullien, who's one of the sharpest French kind of interpreters of Chinese thinking and Chinese strategy, Chinese making for Western audiences. His works in Paris. And this is a very, very interesting, read this, it's very interesting. He said, two notions lie at the heart of ancient Chinese strategy, if you could like to design. On the one hand, the notion of a situation or configuration, as it develops and takes shapes before our eyes as a relationship of forces, so the situation. On the other hand, counterbalancing this, the notion of potential, which is implied by that situation and can be made to play in one's favor. And I know this is consonant with Simon's famous, everybody designs and devises courses of action. Simon's is the blunter American version. Jullien's is richer. The Chinese thought it's more subtle. It's the play between the notion of a situation or configuration as it develops and takes shapes before our eyes, and our developing, this is my rough adaptation of Jullien now, through design iterations, understanding of the potential which is implied by that situation and which can be made to play in one's favor. So, understanding the configuration, understanding the potential, getting to this through design iterations, not abstractly, but working back and forth, so one understands the situation more, one understands the potential more. Cycle. In nature, again, evolution does exactly this, if you like. These are the finches, the famous finches from the Galapagos Islands, whose very particular adaptations of beak to their diet, Darwin noticed. They were primary agents in Darwin's beginning to think about the idea of the origin of species and the theory of evolution. And very interesting, recently scientists have found that in fact there is a genetic pathway underlying the often described process of these beak transformations amongst these 14 varieties of finches that live on the Galapagos Islands, each one of which has a slightly different diet from the others. The beak is almost perfectly adapted for that particular diet. It's a genetic pathway called calmodulin, whose expression during embryonic development changes beak shape, so they found the kind of agency. Now, our agency is not a genetic pathway. It is, in fact, understanding, specifically as we're laying out here. It's the understanding of the dimensions of a situation. I'll leave this on. Let me just read it. As it develops and takes shapes before our eyes, and the parallel understanding of the potential which is implied by that situation as we begin to design for the situation. In many ways, I'm saying here what we're already partly conscious of. So design in this view begin to get a slightly different view of what designing might be. We design for that which has potential, or better, we design so as to be able to realize the potential latent in a situation, or even better, we design so that what we design has the propensity to realize to the maximum all that the situation is capable of. And once we get to that last point, look at the internal relationship to ethics. We don't have to talk about different ethics. Here's Badiou on ethics. I've adapted a page. There's no need for an ethics, Badiou says, but only for a clear vision of the situation. To be faithful to the situation means to deal with the situation according to the rule of maximum possibility, to treat it right to the limit of the possible, or if you prefer, to draw from the situation to the greatest possible extent the affirmative humanity that it contains. That's about as good a paragraph on ethics as you get. It could also describe design. That's trying to say to you that an ethics of design is not external. What we shall look at next week, and then I will look at the following, what Ted is looking at next week is information design, which is mapping, which is how we cite ourselves. And what I will start off with in relationship to Ted's next week is looking at configuration and mapping. And in fact, this whole issue of, in fact, how subject and object get into configuration. So we'll take further this notion of the argument. I'm sorry this was a long lecture, but I'm determined not to get any further behind. Okay, thank you.